Well, hello and welcome back to your third Greensock lesson where we talk about timelines. So, if you look here, I have another open CodePen project. It's similar to the one you saw previously, but the three logos are arranged in a slightly different layout. I have the red logo, which is logo 1 in the top left corner. I have the blue logo, logo 2 in the top right corner, and the green logo in the bottom right. And its ID is logo 3. Okay, so I've decided that I want to animate these logos one after the other, starting with the red one. I'll animate the red one over to the right. It'll slide to the right corner, and then the blue logo will slide down to the bottom right corner, and then this green logo will slide over to the bottom left corner. So I've already shown you how we can use separate tweens to achieve this, or use the stagger function. However, we might run into a slight problem using the stagger function here because we're animating the second object along the y-axis. So we're not going to be able to pass just one set of parameters to animate our entire group of objects along, right? So when you run into situations like that where you want to animate several different objects in multiple different ways on multiple different attributes, then timelines come in very handy. And so the way we're going to animate it in this case is to use a timeline. And first of all, we'll create what I'll call a master timeline. And I'll go ahead and create an instance of this. I'll just start with var. I'll call it master timeline equals new timeline max. And you see me do this in our final animation project. This is how we're going to structure the entire thing. So after I create that instance, now I'm ready to start adding separate tweens to this timeline. And timelines are executed in sequence, right? In order. So the first tween you add gets executed before the last one. So I start off, I say master.tl, I call the to function. All the tuning functions you have access to on the tweenmax object are available to you on your timeline objects. And so I start off animating logo 1, duration 1 second. I want to animate the X attribute over to 850. I can keep chaining animations to my master timeline. And I do that just by adding another 2 right onto the tail of the first one. And we'll do animate logo 2 this time. 1 second. And for logo 2, I want to animate the Y attribute. So I animate that over to 830. And we're going to do the same thing for the third logo. Now in this case here, I'm going to show you an alternate syntax for specifying attribute coordinates that you want to animate to. So you've seen this where I can just pass in the, change that to X first. I can just pass in the actual value of the coordinates that I want to animate to. Now that's an absolute reference. I can also use relative referencing. And to do that, I'll just create a string here. And Greensock allows me to write something like this. I say minus equals 850. And what this does is that it'll animate this third logo over to the left by 850. So it'll use its current position and animate it to a position that's 850 pixels to the left of it. If I'd placed a plus sign in front of this equal sign here, it would have been the exact opposite. It would have animated the logo over to a position that's 850 pixels to the right. Okay, so that's relative referencing. I hit save and I hit run. And our logos animate as expected. Now, one thing you'll notice here is that when you animate the logos, you'll notice that the first logo gets hidden behind the second logo before the second logo gets going. And the same thing happens with the second logo and the third logo. It gets hidden behind the third logo before it starts moving. Well, I'd like to change that. I'd like the second logo, the blue logo, when it's here, to start animating downwards before or right before the first red logo gets to it. So in order to do that, you can use delays, as you know, but when you nest tweens on a timeline, you can actually pass in a fourth attribute, and that's called an offset. And the offset syntax looks like this. Very similar to its relative referencing syntax. And I'll just say, I'd like to start this tween 0.5 seconds before it otherwise would have started. And I'll expand this just so you can read that a lot easier. So I've just passed, as I said, I'd like to start this second tween 0.5 seconds earlier, that's this minus sign, earlier than it would have started otherwise. So now this second tween will start earlier into its sequencing rather than waiting for this first tween to complete its entire animation before starting. So I'll hit run just to demonstrate that. I'll hit run one more time. There we go. And you'll see that the second logo started its animation or its tweening earlier than before. So let's go ahead and add an offset to the last one as well. I'll say equals 0.5 also. Hit save and run. There. And we've just solved the problem with 2 extra parameters, which I think is very cool. Now, another very useful feature on timelines is the ability to nest timelines in other timelines. So I have this master timeline here. I can actually create another timeline if I want and nest it in this master timeline. And in fact, that's why I've named this timeline master. So we have like master and servant timelines, if you want to think of it that way. So let's go ahead and demonstrate that. In order to do this, first I'll delete this third tween. And I'm going to place that in its own timeline and nest it in this master timeline. And I'll create a helper function which will create the timeline I want and return it to the master timeline. And I'll call this function animate logo 3. And in here, I'll do almost exactly the same thing I did with the master timeline. I'll call this logo 3 timeline equals new timeline max. And logo 3 TL and the exact same tween that we had before. I'll place it here, except I'll take out the offset. Okay, and then I'll have to return it. I'll return a timeline like any other regular JavaScript object. And so now this helper function creates its own a little timeline called logo 3 timeline. It's very short. All it does is animate my third logo and it returns the timeline. So now we need to use that timeline. So in here, I'll call a function called add, and I'll just call the helper function since it returns its own timeline, logo 3. Now this should animate this the exact same way, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to comment this out first so you can see what it looks like without the third timeline in there. Okay, as expected, only the first 2 logos animate. Now I'll go back and I'll uncomment the third line there, run it. Okay, so it's animating, and then if I go back to this nested timeline, I can add the offset that was there before. Now when I hit run, everything should animate exactly the way it was before. Perfect. Now that's how to use timelines and nested timelines. We'll be using this extensively in our final animation project. So again, the CodePen URL is at the bottom of your screen. Just go to codepen.io follow this URL and fork this CodePen. Just play around with it, add your own nested timelines if you want, as much as you want, just so you can get familiar with how they function. It's fairly straightforward, but typing it out yourself will help engrave that in your memory. All right, well, that's all for our third lesson. Let's move on to our final Greensock lesson, and then we'll start animating our final project.